So in 1866, Karl Marx formed the International Working Men's Association, or the first international, 1866, right? The Communist Manifesto ends with "Workers of the world unite." He says that the working class has no loyalty to any nation, so he's going to build an international communist organization. And he builds it, and Karl Marx is in London, and they estimate at least 1 to 2 million people were somehow affiliated with it. But it wasn't just followers of Karl Marx. It was basically anyone who believed in any kind of form of socialism. A big section of it were anarchists, and Karl Marx spent a lot of his time at the First International fighting with anarchists. And in 1872, they had the Hague Conference of the First International, in which Karl Marx and followers of Proudhon and Bakunin had their fight, and it eventually led to the split, and by 1877 there really was no First International anymore. The Marxists and the anarchists couldn't get along. The Marxists really couldn't continue having an international. The anarchists continued trying to have an international, but it didn't really work out. The primary difference between them was the effort to seize state power or not. Karl Marx said the effort of the working class was to take control of the government. The anarchists said that taking control of government is oppressive, and that instead they should just form worker cooperatives and independent autonomous unions and things that were not coordinated, because trying to seize government power was a diversion from the workers' struggle, and it would lead to an oppressive state that would be just as bad. And so it was the fight, that was the demise of the First International. 1889, you have the foundation of the Second International. And it's funny because there were 2 Second Internationals that were formed. There was the Marxist one and the non-Marxist one. They eventually merged together. And the flagship party of the Second International was the Social Democratic Party of Germany. And you know, a lot of the names that you associate with Marxism in that time, in the 1890s and 1910, Karl Kautsky, Ebhardt, Edward Bernstein, were affiliated with Marxism in Germany. And Marxism was basically centered in Germany. The German Marxist movement was considered the center of it. And so, 1904, you have a very prominent leader of the Second International and of the German Marxist movement named Edward Bernstein. And Edward Bernstein comes along, and he's not a minor figure, Edward Bernstein, mind you. Edward Bernstein had like family connections to Karl Marx. He had translated some of the volumes of Capital and published them and edited them after Marx's death. He was a very prominent person. And he came out with his theory of revisionism, right? Because at the time, capitalism is transitioning toward imperialism, its third stage. And so because of that, he's saying, why are we not having revolutions? Why are the working class of Europe not rising up? What's going on? Why is the standard of living increasing when Marx theorized that it would continue to go down? What's going on? So Edward Bernstein came out with this theory he called revisionism. He said that Karl Marx's idea that there would be a revolution and that the workers would seize control, that's wrong. He says, socialism is merely the sum of popular reforms. His slogan was, the movement is everything, the goal is nothing, right? And he basically argues that, look, he says, in Germany we have universal male suffrage. No one was even thinking about letting women vote, but they have universal male suffrage. And there's more workers than there are capitalists. So eventually the workers will just outvote the capitalists. We'll have socialism. You know, we have 12-hour factory days. And basically capitalism in the Western world is just kind of naturally turning into socialism. That was Edward Bernstein's theory of revisionism. Now, the term revisionist is kind of a slur. It's like if you don't like someone's theory, you say they're a revisionist. But Edward Bernstein said, I am a revisionist. We need to revise Marxism. And a big part of Edward Bernstein's theory of revisionism was not only this belief that capitalism in the West was just kind of naturally turning into socialism, but that imperialism and the colonization and military interventions in the developing world was good, because the West is already moving towards socialism. So if they take over a country in Africa or they take over a country in Asia, well, that'll help them to get even closer to socialism as well. So the Western capitalist system is just kind of naturally turning into socialism. It's expanding all over the world. Edward Bernstein pushed these views, but the majority of the Marxist movement disagreed with it. Rosa Luxemburg very famously wrote her pamphlet, Reform or Revolution. Karl Kautsky, who was the big theoretician of German social democracy, they rejected the theory of revisionism. But that kind of thinking, revisionism, began, and that kind of laid the basis for a lot of the thinking of what you could call modern social democracy. You know, this belief that the movement is everything, the goal is nothing, that capitalism and socialism are not distinct stages, there's not an event horizon or a revolution. Socialism just kind of naturally evolves out of capitalism, and the West is bringing its more advanced system to the world. That was kind of the basis, and that's how a lot of social democrats in the world today think. Interestingly, though, Kautsky and the Second International rejected revisionism. In 1912, as World War I was on the horizon, you had a gathering, the Basel Congress of the Second International, and all these parties said that they would never support an imperialist war. And they wrote a beautiful manifesto in 1912. World War I is approaching on the horizon. They write, "It would be insanity for the governments not to realize that the very idea of the monstrosity of a world war would inevitably call forth the indignation and the revolt of the working class. The proletarians consider it a crime to fire at each other for the profits of the capitalists, and the ambitions of dynasties with the glory of secret diplomatic treaties." So they're swearing they would never support any war. 1914 comes along, and all of these parties, with a few exceptions, basically supported World War I. And so by 1916, the Second International had collapsed because they had all been at war with each other. The German Social Democratic Party voted for war credits and supported the war, and the British Labour Party and British Socialists also supported it, and French Socialists, and this was the collapse of the Second International. And Vladimir Lenin, who was in Russia, who had the Bolshevik movement, he declared that the Second International was a stinking corpse, and they were filled with outrage. And Rosa Luxemburg, Eugene Debs here in the United States, there was many people in the socialist movement that were furious about the socialist parties that had sworn they would never support World War I, changing their position and supporting the First World War. Lenin blamed it on labor aristocracy. And he said, look, the fact was the German Social Democratic Party, even though it talked a good game and all of that, at the end of the day, it was dominated by wealthy, well, not wealthy, but well-paid industrial workers who identified with German imperialism. And Lenin said that the revolution was going to come from the developing world, from countries where people were being kept deeply poor, not from the first world at that point, because of this stratification. And he called on serious revolutionaries to not organize the labor aristocracy, but to go what he called lower and deeper among the more impoverished and oppressed workers. So World War I was raging. 1917, you have the Bolsheviks come to power in Russia. And then, in 1918, you have the November Revolution in Germany. Right? World War I has ended. There's an armistice already. So the German Kaiser told the Navy to go and commit a suicide mission. Right? To just basically go die. You know, just all die before the war is over. Have a glorious, glorious death. And the German Navy, they thought, okay, the war's already over. We've already surrendered on the land. They refused to do it. And they shot their officers. And you had an uprising all throughout Germany where workers rose up and workers' councils were formed. And from November of 1918 until January, it was a council of people's deputies. It was a Soviet, basically, a workers' council that ran Germany. And it was led by members of the Social Democratic Party and of the Independent Social Democratic Party, which was a party that had split, that had opposed the war. So you have a revolutionary government coming in. The Kaiser steps down. And so the question is Germany going to write a socialist constitution and join the Soviet Union and become a socialist country? Or is Germany going to write a capitalist constitution and just allow the socialists to run in elections? And Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, they formed an organization called Spartacusbund, or Spartacus League, and that was a group of people who wanted to build a Soviet republic in Germany, and they declared in Bavaria, the Bavarian Soviet Republic. But the majority of the social democratic leaders instead wrote a capitalist constitution. And in February, they wrote the Weimar Constitution. They created the Weimar Republic, right? And they created a capitalist constitution. But it was socialists who came to power in a workers' revolution at the end of World War I that created a German capitalist government. And at that moment, that discredited Marxism to Europe in a lot of ways. They had their moment, they had their revolution, and they still managed to wrench defeat out of the jaws of victory. It was amazing. People couldn't believe it. Now, some people say, well, okay, the war had just ended, the population was weary. Perhaps if they had tried to write a socialist constitution, the war would have continued, and France and Britain and the United States would have all invaded. But how realistic is that with Russia already being on the side? You know, it was a moment of opportunism where Marxists and socialists seized power in a revolution and created capitalism. And that was the moment in which you had the Bolsheviks in Russia calling for the creation of the Third International, or the Communist International. It was a new international they created. And we should talk a little bit about Bolshevism, right? Lenin's party in Russia, you had the main Marxist party in Russia, which was the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. But Bolshevism was a different kind of political movement. In 1903, Lenin called for the creation of what he called a party of new type. And it was at a meeting in exile in London. He said they, instead of forming just a regular Marxist party, they should form a party of a new type that would have what he called democratic centralism, meaning that every member was obligated to carry out every decision. And the party of new type wouldn't be for the majority of people. It would be only for those who were willing to give the whole of their lives to the revolutionary movement. And the party of new type would engage in agitation to the broad masses of people and propaganda to the advanced. Right? Whenever there was a disagreement or a strike or a protest, they would agitate and try to create a bigger confrontation. And then they would pick out the smartest people who were capable of becoming communists and propagate Marxism to them and teach them Marxism. And it comes from a whole tradition that they had in Russia, like secret societies and revolutionary organizations. You talk about the Decembrists, you can talk about the Old Believers, right? And at that point, 60% of Russia's population was illiterate. And in 1917, it worked, right? The Tsar was brought down, and later in October, the Bolsheviks came to power. The Party of New Type was a very effective model of organizing in Russia in 1917, and it ultimately came to power. And so, around the world, the Marxists who supported the Russian Revolution formed the Third International. And it was convened in 1919. The Second Congress, Lenin laid out his 21 points for membership in the Third International. There were 21 principles you had to believe in order to be a party in the Second International. There were various parties in the United States that tried to join, but they didn't believe in the 21 points. You have the Communist Party of the United States coming into being as a party that accepts the 21 points. South Africa, their Communist Party, originally had racism in its manifesto and white supremacy. Well, they said you can't join, that's not part of the 21 points. They had to form a new party that was anti-racist. The Communist International forms, they have their international gatherings in Moscow, and they're attempting to form what they call the United Front. And the idea is that after the Russian Revolution, all these second international social democratic parties are in an anti-communist frenzy. They're telling people, oh my gosh, the communists are the worst thing ever. This is why people don't believe in socialism, is because of those evil Reds. They're banning communists from labor unions. They're doing everything they can to just outlaw communists. So Lenin is saying to form the United Front. Let's have a day of protest for an 8-hour workday, for just basic things, and try to get the social democrats and the anarchists to join with us. Unity of action, disagreement on principles. Maybe we don't agree ideologically, but let's try to have united fronts around basic demands. Freeing political prisoners, 8-hour work days, forming unions. So Lenin's urging communists to form united fronts. Lenin dies in 1924. You have the emergence of Trotskyism as a political movement. And the Trotskyists are saying the Soviet Union exists simply as a temporary holdout in a global revolution. They call for permanent revolution. And most of the people in the Soviet Union don't want to have a permanent revolution. They want to start raising the living standards. They've been having civil war, they've been blockaded, they're starving, they're hungry, right? The Communist International thinks that it's best to support the KMT and the nationalist movement in China, Dr. Sun Yat-sen. Trotsky says, oh, no, only the working class, only communists can make the revolution, so he's opposed to that. So the Communist International repudiates Trotskyism, kicks out Leon Trotsky, rejects the theory of permanent revolution. That's 1928. And then you have Bukharin, who comes into existence. And Bukharin is saying that, okay, right, obviously there's not going to be a communist revolution around the world anytime soon. So we'll sign treaties with the West, and we'll try to keep Russia as capitalist as possible, right, and try to get foreign investment to come in. So he's the right opposition. Trotsky is called the left opposition. Bukharin is the right opposition. Both of them are defeated. Stalin comes in. They have the 6th World Congress of the Communist International. And at the 6th World Congress, they declare class against class. And they declare that the history since the Russian Revolution has been divided into 3 periods. There's the first period, which is the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. There's the second period, about the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, capitalist stabilization. But in 1928, they're already seeing the Great Depression on the horizon, and they declare, now we've entered the 3rd period. And in the 3rd period, they say the main enemy is not capitalism, it's social democrats, because they prevented the revolution. And that social democrats are socialist in word, but fascist in deed. They're social fascists. So you have the communist parties of the world fighting against social democrats on the basis that they are social fascists, that they're the main reason you don't have a revolution. And the Great Depression hits, and you have communists leading huge demonstrations of the unemployed. International Unemployment Day, March 6th, 1931. In every major country in Western Europe and in the Soviet Union, Thousands of people are marching, demanding the right to jobs and housing. You have the communists leading things like the Bonus March in Washington, D.C., demanding veterans' benefits be paid. You have these unemployed councils, organizations, almost like workers' councils or Soviets of the unemployed being formed. And you have massive communist parties really booming and coming to existence all across Europe. But then, what happens in response? Germany, you have Hitler comes in. He's a fascist, and he's killing communists and putting them in concentration camps. And you have a rise of fascist movements all over Europe that are saying, okay, to preserve capitalism, we need to have an authoritarian police state that kills communists and exterminates the threat of Marxism. So then you have the 7th World Congress of the Communist International, in which they say, okay, now it's time for communists to lead the People's Front, or the Popular Front against fascism. And because we're communists and we have Marxism, we're going to lead the workers of every country against fascism. And so the communists are aligning with social democrats in anti-fascist united fronts. In the United States, that came in the form of supporting Roosevelt and the formation of popular fronts. And then World War II breaks out. The socialist countries of the world are aligned with the Soviet Union and with the United States and Britain against Hitler. And in 1942, they dissolve the Communist International. And the Trotskyists, who have at that point formed their 4th International, they declare that this is a betrayal. This shows that Stalin has betrayed the revolution. But Mao Zedong in China, he comments on the dissolving of the Communist International. This is what he said. The Communist International, which is far removed from the concrete struggle in each country, was adapted to the relatively simple conditions of the past when changes took place rather slowly. But it is a no longer suitable instrument. He said, for some time it has been felt that centralized organization of an international character was not very appropriate for rapidly organizing. Leading cadres of the communist parties of various countries have already grown and attained political maturity. Since the 7th World Congress of the Communist International in 1935, the Communist International has not intervened in the internal affairs of the Chinese Communist Party, meaning that the Communist International had really kind of stopped being a thing anymore. The communist parties around the world had grown, they'd expanded, and they weren't, Moscow wasn't trying to coordinate their activity at that point. So after the Second World War, you have all these countries across Eastern Europe that are becoming socialist countries. They call them people's democracies, but eventually that moves towards socialism. And you have the birth of China, People's Republic in 1949. So in 1948, Yugoslavia denounces the Soviet Union. And Yugoslavia announces that the Soviet Union is internally meddling in their affairs, and it's unacceptable. And all of a sudden, all the Western capitalist countries love Yugoslavia. That was the first divide. 1956, you have the 20th Party Congress of the USSR. Stalin has died, a new Party Congress in the Soviet Union. Khrushchev comes in and gives the infamous secret speech in which he accuses Stalin of every awful, dirty thing under the sun. And what's interesting about it is Khrushchev's secret speech, a lot of what he's saying is that Stalin is this anti-imperialist, revolutionary, but don't worry, I love the Western capitalists. A lot of the speech focuses on trying to say that Stalin was weak during the Second World War and that he was a coward. Right? He claims that Stalin, when he heard Hitler had invaded, he just sobbed and hid under his desk and all of that. And of course, Stalin was a professional bank robber who walked into banks with a gun. I really don't think he was hiding under his desk and crying. But the secret speech was really Khrushchev groveling before the Western imperialists and saying, don't worry, I'm not a bad guy like Stalin. I'm not a revolutionary. Khrushchev announces that people around the world shouldn't fight Western imperialism because the USA has the atomic bomb and the danger of atomic war is too great. So he says, peaceful coexistence between capitalism and socialism. People in the developing world who are fighting for their national liberation, well, they have to call it off. World war is too dangerous. They call it détente, right, between the United States and the Soviet Union. Well, China disagrees with that. China says that, no, this is a violation, and they accuse the USSR of being revisionist, right? That Edward Bernstein word. They say they're revisionist. They're selling out the revolution. China presents itself as the center of world revolution. 1966, you have China launching the Cultural Revolution, which is an attempt to drive what they call capitalist voters out of the party. And Cuba, North Korea, there's various countries around the world that are neutral, between China and the Soviet Union. The only country that blatantly sides with China is Albania, right? But Cuba is neutral. It's friendly to China and the Soviet Union. North Korea is neutral. A lot of countries are neutral. Albania is solidly with China. So then in 1969, you have the fall of a very prominent leader in the Chinese Communist Party named Lin Biao. And Lin Biao, it's not clear what happened. I guess the official story is that he was on a plane trying to flee to the Soviet Union after he tried to kill Mao or something. It's not clear what happened. After the fall of Lin Biao, you see a dramatic shift in Chinese foreign policy. It starts out in Angola, where China is aligning with the CIA to fight against the pro-Soviet Communist Party of Angola. You have the rise of the Gang of Four in China, which are 4 party leaders, including Mao's wife. They published what they call the theory of 3 worlds, which is the idea that the Soviet Union and the United States are the first world, Europe is the second world, and there's the third world, and China is going to lead the third world against both of those countries. Later they announced the Soviet Union is the main danger to the people of the world, and they're urging communists around the world to fight against the Soviet Union. You have the Vietnam War. After the Vietnam War, you have the Kampuchea War, very famous, right? And the Kampuchea War is an instance where Vietnam has, the United States has withdrawn from Vietnam. Vietnam is a Soviet-aligned country. Then you have Pol Pot, the leader of Kampuchea, who is calling himself a Maoist and is aligned with China. And so Pol Pot and Vietnam have a war. The United States is covertly sending weapons and guns to Pol Pot. Pol Pot is claiming that Vietnam is a colony of the Soviet social imperialists. China and the USA are supporting Pol Pot. The Soviet Union is supporting Vietnam, and you have thousands of communists killing other communists in an ugly, destructive mess that's really fomented by Brzezinski. And it's fomented by the West. The US intelligence agencies figured, okay, we couldn't defeat the communists with our own method of mass bombing and killing, so what we can do is we can manipulate and get communists killing other communists. 1978, you have the formation of Euro-communism, where the Italian Communist Party, the French Communist Party, the Communist Party of Spain had a convention and denounced the Soviet Union. And you have Brzezinski in the United States, the National Security Advisor Carter, praising them and saying, well, we like the Euro-communists. The United States likes the Euro-communists. It doesn't like the Soviet communists, doesn't like the Chinese communists. We like the Euro-communists. So this is the international communist movement. And let me add that there's also the Fourth Internationals, right? We don't want to forget that. At this point, I believe there are 6 different Trotskyist Fourth Internationals that are keeping the flame of Trotskyism going. You still have the International Meeting of Communist and Workers' Parties that takes place, I believe, every few years. You have the World Festival of Youth and Students, which is a gathering of communist and socialist and anti-imperialist youth organizations. I've been to one. I've been to 2 of them, actually. I know some of the people, the Students and Youth for a New America, went to the recent one. You have the World Federation of Trade Unions, which is an alliance of communist trade unions. You have the Women's International Democratic Federation, which is an international alliance of communist women's organizations. And let's not forget you have Maoists, right? People who think that the Soviet Union became capitalist and are holding on to that line of the Gang of Four and Mao. You have followers of Enver Hoxha who think that that Albania was the one true socialist country. Often they'll have names like the Communist Party, Marxist-Leninist, as opposed to the Communist Party. And that's where the communist movement is at. But I want to end this section by pointing out, the Cuban Revolution was led by Fidel Castro. Was Fidel Castro a member of the Communist Party? No. His brother, Raul, was a member of the Communist Party, but the Communist Party told him not to participate in his brother's revolution, and he did it anyway. The July 26 movement that created the Cuban Revolution was not part of the international communist movement. Let me add that. Hugo Chavez, was he a member of the Communist Party? No, he was not. The Bolivarian movement was an independent socialist movement. The Communist Party eventually supported it, but he was not part of it. Michel Aflaq, the creator of Ba'athist Arab socialism, was not part of the Syrian Communist Party. In fact, it was his independent movement that broke with the Communist Party that brought socialism to Syria and Iraq and elsewhere. Mao Zedong, interestingly, had been an anarchist prior to joining the Communist Party and becoming a founding member. He had an organization called the New People's Study Society that he led, and they followed the teachings of Peter Kropotkin. And they weren't really interested in Marxism because China was a majority peasant country. And so Marxism was about factory workers fighting the bosses. That didn't really apply to China. But Kropotkin's theory about the peasantry fighting to seize its land appealed to Mao, who was organizing in China. Now, when the Bolshevik Revolution happened, he ended up joining the Communist Party at its founding Congress. But Mao originally had been his own separate grouping that was inspired by Peter Kropotkin's anarchism. And even Bolshevism, the Leninist movement, was not part of the mainstream of global Marxism. They were a dissident party that had their party of new type theory and their different organization and different ideas about imperialism. You talked about Kautsky's theory of ultra-imperialism. That was the main view within the Second International. Lenin's theory of imperialism was a separate theory. The Bolsheviks were also kind of independent of the global Marxist movement. So that raises the question, and I'll end this section by raising the question, what is the significance of the international Marxist movement, and what can we learn from it, and what can we not learn from it?